One time, somebody asked me how I could keep fighting even when it felt like we were losing. And my response was, I would rather fight until my last breath for the world to be more just than to just hide my head and pretend that it was going to get better without effort.
Welcome to Identity Unveiled. IU is a platform that supports advancement of Asian American women to the executive ranks. We highlight amazing stories of Asian American women becoming the first in their industry or breaking barriers as executives and leaders.
Diane and I were both raised by immigrant parents where talking with your mom, let alone your dad, about sex was just a very taboo topic. In fact, you quite frankly didn't. Well, information about sex and your bodies came from your health class in school. However, today, second generation and on listeners have expressed a desire to be that source for open conversations with their children about sex. In fact, I can recall very recently a conversation with moms that they wanted to be the first point of contact when it came to talking to their daughters and their sons about sex. Well, our guest today is Chris Harley. She's the head of SIECUS, or known as Sexuality Information and Education Council. It's a nonprofit organization that's dedicated to advancing sex education through advocacy, policy, and coalition building.
Chris is president and CEO of SIECUS. We didn't know about Chris when we reached out to her, but her passion was Asian American civil rights. Before joining SIECUS, she founded the 2020 Consulting and directed the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights 2020 Census Campaign. She also served as director of the Intergovernmental Affairs of the White House Initiative on AAPI during the Obama administration. She's also Korean American, Native American, a single mom by choice of twin boys, and first generation of her family to attend college and graduate school. Hi, Chris. Welcome to IU.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Chris, where did you grow up?
I grew up in Annapolis, Maryland, so on the East Coast.
And so you talk very openly about coming from both a half Korean, half Native American household. What was that like?
Well, in many ways, it is a typical story in Asian America. We were one of the only Asian American families in our community. We're a predominantly white community. And so we certainly grew up feeling different. My mother stood out as being an immigrant and having an accent. A lot of times, friends would come over to the house and be told to take their shoes off, and that was confusing, or the first time they had been asked to do that. But in a lot of ways, I think it really shaped my understanding of being an American, that my father is Piscataway Indian. It's the indigenous people of Maryland. And so I've grown up on ancestral land. And having an immigrant mother really gave me, I think, a much more nuanced and comprehensive perspective on what the American experience and experiment actually is in terms of the diversity of folks who call America home.
You were the first of your siblings to go to college. Was there an expectation? Are you the oldest, and so you were expected to go? I mean, what really brought that decision about?
Again, I think that this really speaks to the diversity of my family's experience. On my father's side of the family, my grandfather only finished 5th grade. My aunts and uncles didn't attend college. On my mother's side, even though we're Korean immigrants and many people of the Korean diaspora came to the United States for educational opportunities or career opportunities in the 80s, my family actually came as economic refugees and hadn't accessed higher education. So for me, I got to see both the way that intergenerational trauma occurs because of imperialism and Western nation building in Asia, as well as the generational harm that occurs because of lack of access, because of colonization of indigenous people in the United States as well. So for me, going to college was a really big thing. I did get a lot of encouragement from my mother, who saw it as a pathway to opportunity. I also was given a lot of support from my father that if that wasn't the right choice for me, that there were other pathways. And so there was that opportunity to kind of make a decision about how to move forward. But I was really interested in learning more and exploring the diversity of the United States. And so I wanted to get out of my hometown because I wanted to experience how to be in this world where there was people who came from different backgrounds and lived experiences for me, and so that I could understand what that community could look like. And so I was really lucky. I went to Oberlin College, which is a small liberal arts school in Ohio. I don't know how I got in there because I really didn't know what I was doing. I actually found Oberlin because a friend of mine was considering the conservatory, which is the music school. And I saw the brochure on the ground in her bedroom. I was like, oh, what's this? Like, this looks interesting. And applied. And fortunately, they accepted me and it changed the pathway of my life.
Yeah, Chris, that's incredible. As an Asian and Indian background, what led you to go into civil rights?
Well, if you know anything about Oberlin, it is a school where the students take social justice values very seriously. And so throughout my college experience, we were having very rigorous conversations about how to live our lives with the values where racial justice, gender equity, LGBTQ equality, these different intersections of how opportunity and privilege clash for marginalized people in the United States, and trying to figure out how to apply our education in a way that would grant better access for everyone. And I was very involved in the Asian American community. I was very involved in the broader communities of color on campus. And I felt like it was important for there to be voices that were speaking to the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander experience, because it's often seen as less urgent than other issue areas where access and opportunity is provided. And yet the shared experiences of Asian Americans of being kept out of conversations where power and privilege are negotiated can result in profoundly disenfranchising experiences for those of us who have the least amount of access and economic opportunity. And so it felt a really important place to be in talking about the immigrant experience and how that shapes one's ability to thrive in the United States.
This Asian American civil rights is really under the radar. We don't hear a lot. We love that you're the first on our show on this, and want to hear more about, some people may be even surprised that an Asian civil rights movement is happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the part of the problem is that the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander community is so broad. It is so diverse. We're talking about hundreds of different countries and hundreds of different languages, and the pathway to get to the United States is varied, right? We're coming from war, we're coming from economic opportunity, we're coming from, a range of kind of push-pull factors across the continent. And yet, you hear so often about people coming being the only ones of their ethnicity in a particular community, not having access to language services to be able to navigate, government programs or schools or, businesses. You hear of people who are highly skilled and highly trained in their home community having to come to the United States and take jobs as taxi drivers or as small business owners because that's the only way they can make a living for their families. I worked in the past on issues of salons where, you could get a certification to run a nail salon with limited English, be able to earn enough of a living to have a stable livelihood for your family, and yet you're being subjected to chemicals and toxins that are killing your body and endangering your families because that industry is not monitored by US labor laws the same way that more secure positions are. And so there's a range of issues related to data and language access and economic opportunity that Asian Americans often struggle through, but then struggle silently and without a lot of recognition and support. I think the other thing that I find so important is that when we're also talking about issues of violence, oftentimes when people have racist intent and are coming after communities of color, Asian Americans stand out as being more different looking and easy to target. And so I often see that Asian Americans are included in those racially motivated attacks. And again, it's often unrecognized because the motivation may not feel the same or feel like it's coming from the same place, because it might be economic constraints or things of that nature. But I think it's really important to recognize that that's also happening, and that, our community members are validly walking through the world with a certain level of fear of how their difference may be perceived.
Chris, if I'm in an elevator and I bump into someone and I say, I'm an advocate for Asian civil rights, and they look at me and they say, what exactly are you advocating? How are they a disenfranchised group? I mean, what rights do they not have? How would you respond? What is it that we're lacking? What is it about our rights that have either been taken away or, like you said, not being seen? What are we fighting for?
I think that we are fighting for equal access across the various entry points that communities navigate opportunity and access. I think that it is very telling. For example, one issue that I worked on was the Affordable Care Act. It turns out that certain Asian American communities have the highest rates of being uninsured and lacking access to affordable healthcare. And that's often because many of them are navigating language differences. They can't even find doctors who they can communicate with to talk to about healthcare. And yet there were no programs that were designed to help Asian Americans access and sign up for the Affordable Care Act when that big push was happening a couple of years ago. And so individual community groups had to coordinate together to provide language translation, to provide translation services, to be able to help Asian Americans who were most left out of the healthcare system access to the program. Similarly, that happens, again, in economic situations. And I spoke about the fact that there are immigrants who come to this country who are highly skilled and yet can only obtain low service jobs because their certifications are not recognized. And so they end up in low income fields where they're struggling paycheck to paycheck to provide for their families, often sacrificing, in hopes of giving their offspring an opportunity to find a foothold in America. These areas of access transcend ethnicity and nationality in the Asian American community and line up with other communities. I think the immigrant rights justice conversation is also one that pertains very closely to Asian Americans. But again, they're often left out of these conversations because we don't hold those conversations in languages that Asian immigrants can even participate in, right? So then when we're making policy about who gets to come to the United States and how they get to come to the United States, Asian Americans are left out. And so then access programs are denied to them.
During Hurricane Harvey, that was an issue. I worked with the government on issuing immediately what can we do to help the Asian American community, because we have hundreds of dislocated people from Louisiana flooding into Houston, and the mayor and all sorts of government entities. What are we doing to help the Asian communities who are lacking information? If you need access to help mitigate the flood situation at your house, what resources do you call? Well, all the pamphlets are in English or Spanish. There are no Vietnamese pamphlets. So in times of national crisis, emergencies will really put to the test. Our communities aren't helped because there's such a lack of resources. So
yes,
we really need to amplify your work, Chris, in terms of the Asian civil rights broadly speaking. It's so needed. You were talking, there's just so many aspects that you really knock out there, but each one we can really dive into. Now, you also were working under the Obama administration as the Director of Intergovernmental Affairs at the White House, right? What initiative did you want to bring to the table in front of Obama?
I was very lucky to work on a range of really important issues during my time at the White House Initiative on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Of course, during the Obama administration, the Affordable Care Act was front and center. And so we spent 4 years working really hard to help bridge this gap in understanding and translation and access to the Affordable Care Act and getting as many people as we could to enroll in it. And I was really fortunate to work with community leaders who helped more than 1 million Asian Americans enroll during that enrollment period process. And what I wanted to bring to the Obama administration was the recognition that engaging with Asian American communities around these issues of translation and language access and recognizing the places of disparity, that when you also supported Asian American communities to engage with government programs, that they actually took advantage of that and participated. Because I think that that's a big misconception that Asian American communities don't engage or aren't involved. But in fact, it's because we don't make enough effort to bring them into the conversation so that their voices and needs can be included in conversations around opportunity and access. But I also was able to work on things like I mentioned, the nail salon issue where they were being exposed to toxins. We worked on Native Hawaiian sovereignty conversations, trying to figure out how to provide greater protections for the Native Hawaiian population. So there was a number of areas that I was really privileged to be a part of. And then being able to work across government agencies where these similar kinds of needs could be addressed and figuring out how to support federal agencies in creating more language access, recognizing where to provide that kind of access and outreach to communities so that they could be better served was a really important part of my job.
I'd like to move on to your work at SIECUS.
Yeah.
Been there for now 5 years. What led you to SIECUS and its advocacy work?
What I realized when I started at SIECUS is that sex education is actually foundational to us as humans in being able to understand how to navigate healthy, respectful, open relationships across the variety of human experiences that people have. And I thought about it at the time, Brett Kavanaugh was being confirmed to the United States Supreme Court. And this conversation around Me Too and consent and what had happened in his younger days and the impact that that had on conversations that women in particular were having around sexual violence and sexual assault that they had experienced across different areas of their life. And I realized if we provided sex education where boys were taught to respect women, where bodily autonomy was understood as an inherent human right, and consent was taught, we would be having a completely different conversation than what we were having at that time. And so what I realized is that sex education is one of these foundational blocks that gives us the tools to have these broader, greater conversations around race and sexual identity and gender identity and sexual orientation that we weren't having, that we haven't been able to have, or we're just starting to have as a country in ways that were much more grounded in fact, in developmentally appropriate information and medically accurate information that could actually help young people navigate the world and the diversity of experience that we are now really being able to see with greater fluidity. And it became really important for me to be a part of that conversation, to be thinking about how all of these aspects of the human experience impact the way that people are able to show up and live in the world, but also how we can relate to one another and see each other's diversity as things that can still be valued and respected, even if it's different from our own experience. And so that's been the mission that I've been engaged in since I've been at SIECUS.
Is there a tie between the work that you're doing for the Asian community and the tie with what you're doing at SIECUS?
I think certainly my work at SIECUS is very much informed by my experience as being an Asian American woman, right? Asian American women are often seen or perceived as being submissive. They're expected to be sexually deviant. There's a lot of stereotypes that go into the way that people approach and think about Asian American women. That certainly shaped my life. I remember being a 16-year-old girl working in a bookstore and having a 30-year-old white man approach me and ask me out on a date, knowing how old I was, knowing that I was still in school. And it wasn't until later that I realized that he had a fetish for young Asian girls and expected me to perform a particular role for him. You know, I don't even want to go there. Anyways, so certainly I recognize that my identity as a woman of color informs the way that I'm impacted by the world. And that is true for all of us and all of these young people. And those ideas that I took from Oberlin College, right, of how do we live into values where everyone is able to give in access and opportunity to live their full lives with the ability to do so in the United States, directly informs the conversations that we're having at SIECUS. How do we make sure that whether a young person is trans or a Black male or, you know, exploring their sexual identity, that that's all being done in a way where they're given the information and facts to make the best choices for themselves to live their true lives, and not be denied opportunity and access because of the way that they show up in the world. And that's certainly what we're seeing right now happen. I think it's also important within the Asian American community that these kinds of conversations are spoken about aloud, because certainly Asian Americans are impacted by the same kind of cultural nuance and diversity that, or culture clash, I would say, that we see happen across Asian American generations. We have an old school generation that moves through the world a certain way, and, you know, a younger generation that is trying to figure out, how do I hold my identity but still live into values that help me be seen and my kids to be seen differently. And having the ability to speak about sexuality and sex is certainly a big part of that.
Chris, when it comes to your own identity, I'm curious because so much of your work is around the Asian civil rights movement, yet even the indigenous people of America have also not been seen as well. How did you make the decision to, I guess, pursue your work within the Asian space and not focus on the indigenous part?
Yeah, I think that is a question that maybe some people have. The Piscataway is a indigenous tribe of Maryland that was unrecognized by the federal government and by the state government for many, many years. We had to fight a 30-year campaign to receive recognition by the state of Maryland. We still have not received recognition from the federal government, despite all of the evidence and genealogy records and historical records that we have. And so that really affects the conversation that happens in Indigenous communities around authenticity and birthright. And so it was a choice because I know that I'm perceived more frequently as Asian American than as Indigenous. And my access to my Indigenous identity was more fraught because it's not recognized by governmental bodies. And so it felt like an easier road to engage in civil rights through the immigrant and Asian American experience. Although I've never stopped participating in Indigenous rights efforts as well, which is part of the reason that I was involved with the Native Hawaiian sovereignty conversation within the Obama administration, because that felt really important to, you know, as an Indigenous population that had been denied recognition and had our rights not be protected as a result, I wanted to make sure that that wasn't continuing to manifest for another community that deserved the same ability to have protection of their sovereignty.
Well, I want to change the subject here and talk about something you did that was really incredible. I'm still mind-boggled and I want to learn more. So I'm sure our audience has heard maybe the term, I'm not infertile, I'm just single. And being a single mom by choice is such a brave journey. So Chris, like, truly bravo, but we want to dive into that. So many women on this journey to be a single mom by choice are really struggling because of multiple factors such as career. What was the final straw for you to push forward and make that decision?
Yeah, I think it's a big choice, and it's one that I've never regretted and has been one of the most meaningful experiences of my life. I think what it came down to was realizing that while I was getting up in years, I hadn't yet found a partner who I felt like I could make that kind of commitment to. It was really important to me to experience motherhood. And I recognized that I could experience motherhood through a multitude of strategies. But if I could, I'd also like to experience pregnancy. And when I hit a moment in my career where I had the economic means to make that choice for myself, I went ahead and did it. And I was very lucky that I was blessed with twins. So I got a 2-for-1 special. And, it is a big choice. It was a big decision. My, Asian mother was definitely not particularly fond of this course of action. But, ultimately I realized this is my life, right? And I was the one who was going to live it. I didn't want to live in regret. And I knew that once I gave her beautiful babies, she would be fine. And she was and has been. And so they're 8 years old now. I could not be more blessed.
Amazing, amazing. I love hearing your journey. It's a really difficult decision when age and career and life partners, they just sometimes don't all line up, but you got to look out for yourself, right? Talking about your mom, growing up myself in an immigrant household, and many people in our generation, our Asian American generation, we were helping our parents. For me, for example, I'm ordering food for them. They can't, read a fancy French menu or even an English menu that has some really cool dishes on there. So there are luxuries that our parents sometimes don't always experience. But us in our generation living here in America, we can go travel, we can find the coolest hole-in-the-wall restaurants. We use Yelp. My parents stick with 5 restaurants and keep it on repeat. And so again, it comes down to this access to resources, language, but at a large level, it's federal resources and outreach to communities. You're involved in so many advocacy efforts. And what is a legacy you want to leave?
One time somebody asked me how I could keep fighting even when it felt like we were losing. And my response was, I would rather fight until my last breath for the world to be more just than to just hide my head and pretend that it was going to get better without effort. And so I think that is a legacy that I'd like to leave behind, that it's always worth it to keep fighting for better. Rather than settling for being made to feel less.
I love it. Well, Chris, thank you for your time today.
Chris, thank you so much for your time today. Learned a lot, things that I had no idea about the Asian civil rights movement, and I will definitely be checking out your website as I continue to have conversations with my girls so that they are as informed as I was not informed growing up. Thank you.
Absolutely.